Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight we have a long, quiet story for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There is no music tonight, no sudden noises, no need to follow every word. If you drift off in chapter 2, the rest of the story will play on quietly without you. That is how it is meant to be. If these stories help you settle, the like button and the bell tell the algorithm to bring them to other people who need them too. Tartan Lullaby is supported by listener purchases through the links below the video, which is how the channel keeps going. When you are ready, we will begin. Welcome, settle in wherever you are. Tonight, we are going to a small croft on the western side of the Isle of Lewis, the largest of the islands of the Outer Hebrides, in the year 1900. 12 chapters, one for each month of a full crofting year. From the first lambs of March, through the spring sowing and the moving of the cattle to the summer pastures, the long midsummer light, the peat cutting, the hay, the harvest, the herring, the cattle coming down, the long dark evenings of winter, and back round again to the first soft light of February. There is no story to follow, no plot to keep hold of, only one slow year on one small Hebridean croft, told gently, month by month. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath find its own pace. There is nowhere else to be. It is March, in the year 1900, on the Isle of Lewis, the largest of the islands of the Outer Hebrides, lying out beyond the long arm of the Minch, from the western coast of Scotland. The island is wide and low and long, more than 50 miles from its southern tip to its northern point at the Butt of Lewis, almost all of it covered in peat moor and small dark lochs, with the croft townships gathered in long straggling lines along its coast, where the land meets the sea, and where a thin band of more workable soil lies between the moor and the shore. We are at a small croft in one of these townships, on the western side of the island, where the land falls in a long, slow slope from the moor down to the Atlantic. The croft is a strip of ground, perhaps 4 acres at the most, running from the public road at the back down toward the shore at the front. On it stand the buildings of the family. There is the Taig Tughaid, the thatched house, which is the dwelling, low and long with rounded ends and thick walls of stone and turf, and a roof of thatched marram grass and barley straw weighted down with ropes of heather and stones. There is the byre, attached at one end of the house, where the cows winter under the same roof as the family. There is a small barn for storing oats and barley. There is a stackyard. There is, beyond the buildings, the inby ground, the small bit of cultivated land closest to the house, divided into long, narrow, raised beds called fenagan, lazy beds, where the potatoes and the barley will go. And there is the out-by ground, which runs out toward the moor, the rough grazing for the cattle and the sheep, with the small lochen at the back marking the edge of the croft. At this hour, in the late afternoon of an early March day, the light is the soft grey-silver of a Hebridean late winter, with the sun low in the southwest and a thin band of pale gold along the western horizon where it will, in another hour, slip down behind the long flat line of the open Atlantic. The wind is up. in the way that the wind is almost always up on Lewis in March, a steady west wind off the sea, carrying the cold salt smell of the open ocean. It comes across the croft in slow long pushes, lifting the dry rushes by the locken, ruffling the small dark surface of the water, stirring the thin dry stalks of last year's grasses on the dunes between the croft and the shore. The croft, after the long quiet of winter, is beginning very gently to wake. The Gaelic, the old woman of the house, who is perhaps in her 60s and is the bean and taig, the woman of the house, has come out of the front door of the Taig Tughaid with a small wooden bucket in her hand. She is wrapped in a long dark woolen shawl, with a white linen mutch on her head against the wind, and her stout leather boots make a soft heavy sound on the trodden earth of the doorstep. She walks slowly, in the slow patient way of a woman who has walked this same short path between the house and the byre every day of her adult life, around the corner of the house to where the byre door opens onto the small cobbled yard. Inside the byre it is dim and warm. The two cows of the croft, small black Highland cattle with long shaggy coats and long curved horns, are standing on the deep straw bedding that the Gaelic and her daughter-in-law have built up over the long winter months. The straw is now a foot deep in places, soft and dry on the top, slowly composting beneath, holding the cows warm through the cold nights and slowly building, over the months, the precious dung that will go on the lazy beds in the spring. But it is one of the sheep, not the cows, that has called the Gaelic out at this hour. In a small wooden pen at the back of the byre, separated from the cows by a low partition of wattle, a single Cheviot ewe is lying down. She has been brought in from the small fold at the edge of the out-by ground 3 days ago, when the Gaelic saw that her time was close. She is one of the first ewes to lamb this year. The rest of the small flock, perhaps 30 ewes and a single ram, are still out on the moor, on the rough heather grazing that the township shares as common ground. The Gaelic kneels beside the ewe in the dim light and lays her hand on the ew's flank. The ewe is breathing slowly, her wool slightly damp with the work of the past hour. The Gaelic speaks to her in the soft Gaelic that is the only language ever spoken in this house, a few quiet, steady words, the way a woman speaks to an animal she has known since the animal was a lamb herself. And then, in the soft, fading light through the small byre window, the first lamb comes. It comes the way lambs come, in a sudden small slither of wet wool and slow movement, onto the deep straw bedding. The Gaelic is ready. She lifts the small wet body, clears the membrane from the small face, wipes the small nostrils with the corner of her shawl, and lays the lamb at the ew's nose. The ewe, lying still, lifts her head, looks at the small new thing, and begins very slowly to lick. The Gaelic sits back on her heels and watches. There is no hurry. The licking will warm the lamb and clean it and tell the ewe, in the deep, slow language of sheep, that this is her own. In a quarter of an hour, perhaps, the lamb will lift its small, shaky legs and begin to look for the milk. In the morning, it will be standing properly by its mother in the corner of the pen. In a week, it will be out with the ewe in the small fold by the byre, learning the smell of the wind and the taste of the spring grass. But for now there is only the small wet lamb on the straw, and the slow patient licking, and the Gaelic watching, and the dim afternoon light through the small byre window. Behind her, further down the croft, the Gaelic's son, the bodach who will be the man of the house, when the old grandfather finally goes, is walking slowly along the line of the lazy beds with a small wooden spade in his hand, looking at the ground. The lazy beds are still bare. They will not be turned for another month at the earliest, perhaps 6 weeks if the weather holds cold. But it does no harm, on an early March afternoon, to walk along them and look. He is checking for damage from the winter, for any place where the rabbits have been at the edge of a bed, for any soft spot where the seaweed compost has slumped. He moves slowly, with the long, patient step of a man who is in no rush and who will be doing this same walk on these same beds for many more years yet. At the front of the house, the daughter-in-law, the young woman of the croft, has come out to gather in the washing. She has hung sheets and a few small clothes on a line of rope strung between 2 stone uprights at the front of the house, and the wind has been at them all afternoon, drying them stiff and clean. She lifts the sheets down one by one and folds them over her arm, and her small daughter, perhaps 4 years old, follows her along the line, holding a corner. The shalings are still empty out on the moor. The lambs are only just beginning. The lazy beds are not yet turned. The sea is still grey. The wind off the Atlantic is still cold. But the year on this small croft on the western side of Lewis is beginning. Stay with them in the soft fading light of the late winter afternoon, and let the small slow work of the croft be the sound at the edge of your hearing. There is nowhere else to be. The lamb is on the straw. The ewe is licking. The year has turned. It is April now, on the same small croft on the western side of the Isle of Lewis. The wind has shifted in the last week from the cold, steady west wind of March to a softer southwest wind, still strong but no longer carrying the bite of winter in it. The light has grown longer. The sun, in mid-afternoon, is now well up over the moor, throwing the long, thin shadows of the gable ends of the houses across the trodden earth of the yards. The first small bog cotton is showing on the moor, the small white tufts lifting in the wind. The first small yellow heads of marsh marigold are showing in the wet places along the burns, and on the croft, the work of sowing has begun. The Gaelic's son, the man of the croft, is at the lazy beds with his cascrome, the foot plough, the long-handled wooden spade with the iron-shod blade, and the wooden footrest that has been the principal cultivating tool of the Hebridean crofter, since long before any of the ancestors of this family came to live on this particular piece of ground. The cascrome is not a plough drawn by a horse. It is a hand tool worked by one man who drives the iron blade into the soil with the weight of his foot on the wooden rest, levers up a thin slab of earth, turns it, and steps forward to the next stroke. It is slow work. A full day with the cascrome will turn perhaps 1/8 of an acre. But the cascrome does what no horse plough could do on this thin, uneven, peaty soil between the rocks. It works the small spaces between the boulders. It lifts the wet, peaty turf without compacting the soil beneath. It builds up the long, narrow, raised beds, the lazy beds, that lift the crop above the wet ground and let the rain run off into the small ditches between. The man works steadily along the bed, in the slow, even rhythm of a man who has done this since he was 12 years old, who learned it from his father, who learned it from his father, who learned it in the years before the Crofters' Act and before the Land League, when the croft was held on a precarious yearly tenancy and a man could be cleared off it at the Lord's whim. The man works now in the spring of 1900 with the quiet sense, which his father did not have, that the croft is in some real sense his own, that he cannot be evicted from it on the agent's word, that the work he does on these beds will be the work he or his son will do here next year, and the year after, and the year after that. He does not think about this as he works. The mind of a man at the Cascrome does not think about Acts of Parliament. The mind of a man at the Cascrome thinks about the next step, the depth of the next stroke, the weight of the soil on the blade, the line of the bed. But the dignity of it is there, in the slow, even rhythm of the work, in the soft sound of the blade going into the soil, in the small thump of the turned slab, in the long, patient afternoon. A little behind him, his wife is at work too, and so is the Gaelic, and so are the small daughter and her younger brother, who is now perhaps 6 years old. They are at the work of bringing the seaweed up from the shore. The lazy beds of Lewis, like the lazy beds of every Hebridean croft, are fertilized with seaweed. The thin, peaty soil of the island would grow almost nothing on its own. It is the long, slow application of seaweed, year after year, generation after generation, that has built the lazy beds up into the dark, rich, crumbly earth that will grow potatoes and barley and oats. The seaweed is gathered from the shore at low tide, in the great long brown drifts that the spring tides leave on the rocks, and it is carried up to the croft in creels on the women's backs. The creel is a flat-bottomed basket woven of split willow, with 2 long shoulder straps of woven horsehair. It is carried high on the back, with the bottom of the creel resting against the small of the back, and the load rising up to the height of the shoulders. A full creel of wet seaweed weighs perhaps 50 pounds. The women carry them up from the shore by the small stone path that runs along the edge of the croft, in slow, even loads, 4 or 5 trips in an afternoon, building up the small green-brown heap by the edge of the lazy beds. The Gaelic's daughter-in-law, who is perhaps 30 years old and strong from years of this work, is at the shore now with her creel on her back, bent over the seaweed, picking the best fronds, the long brown ribbons of laminaria and the soft yellow-green fronds of bladderwrack, packing them into the creel with quick, practiced hands. The small daughter is with her, picking up the smaller pieces and handing them up. The small son is further along the shore, throwing small stones into the slow swell. The smell at the shore is the smell of seaweed in the sun. It is a strong smell, iodine and salt, and the soft green smell of growing things, but it is not unpleasant. It is the smell, for a Lewis crofter, of the spring. It is the smell of the lazy beds being fed. It is the smell of the potatoes that will come up in July and the barley that will come up in August. It is the smell of the year doing its work. The daughter-in-law lifts the full creel onto her back, settles the straps on her shoulders, and begins the slow climb up the small stone path from the shore to the croft. The path is steep at the bottom, then easier as it comes up onto the level ground of the Inby. She walks slowly, leaning a little forward against the weight, her boots making a small steady sound on the path. At the top of the path, by the lazy beds, she swings the creel down and tips the seaweed onto the small heap at the edge of the bed her husband has just finished turning. The seaweed lies in a soft pile, dark green-brown, still wet, glistening in the afternoon light. The Gaelic comes out from the house with a small wooden bowl in her hand. In the bowl is a small portion of the seed potatoes that have been stored in the dim back room of the house since last autumn, kept in dry sand, kept cool, kept just on the edge of sprouting. The seed potatoes are small, the size of a child's fist, with the small pink-purple eyes just beginning to show. They are the cuttings of last year's crop, saved over the winter, the same line of potatoes that has been grown on this croft for many years. The Gaelic sets the bowl down at the end of the bed. She kneels in the soft, turned earth. She takes a single seed potato in her hand, and with the small wooden trowel she carries in her apron pocket, she scoops a small hole in the bed, lays the seed potato in it with the eye facing up, covers it gently with the soft earth, and moves a hand's breadth along the bed to the next planting. She works slowly, in the long, even rhythm of a woman who has planted potatoes on this same bed for 40 years. Above her, on the small stone wall by the byre, a single corn bunting is calling, the small churring song that says the spring is properly here. Out on the moor behind the croft, a curlew is calling, the long bubbling whistle that lifts and falls. Down on the shore, the gulls are calling over the seaweed that the daughter-in-law has been gathering. The wind, soft and steady, is moving across the croft. The lazy beds are being turned, the seaweed is going on, the potatoes are going in, the barley and the oats will follow in the next weeks. The year, in April on a small croft on the western side of Lewis, is at the work of beginning. Stay with them in the soft, long light of the spring afternoon, and let the slow, even sound of the cascrome be the sound at the edge of your hearing. There is nowhere else to be. It is May now, on the small croft on the western side of the Isle of Lewis. The grass on the Inby ground has come up properly in the last 2 weeks. The thin, pale green of the early spring shoots has thickened into the deep, soft green of full grass, ankle-deep in places, with the small white heads of clover beginning to show among the blades. The ditches are running clear. The hedges of stunted hawthorn at the edge of the road are showing their first soft green leaves. The sea, off to the west, is a soft blue rather than the grey slate of March, with the long, slow Atlantic swell catching the sun in soft flashes. And today, in the early morning of a soft May day, the work of moving the cattle to the shalings has begun. The shalings, in Gaelic the Éireag, are the summer pastures. They lie up on the moor, 4 or 5 miles inland from the township, on the higher, rougher ground where the small fresh hill burns run down toward the lochs. The grazing on the shalings is poor by lowland standards, a mix of hill grass and heather and bog cotton and small soft mosses, but it is grazing that is fresh in the early summer, and it has the great virtue of being far from the Inby ground of the croft. This matters on a small Hebridean croft, because the Inby ground must be allowed, for the months of summer, to grow the hay and the barley and the oats. If the cows were left on the Inby, they would eat the hay and trample the crops. So in early May, when the new grass on the shalings is just coming up, the cows are walked, the long, slow walk up onto the moor, where they will spend the summer. And the women go with them. This is the Éireag, the summer transhumance, an old practice on the islands and on the western Highland mainland, the practice of moving the cattle and a portion of the household to the summer pastures for the months when the Inby must be left to grow. On Lewis in 1900, the practice is still alive, although it is beginning to wane, and there are townships further south on the island where the earig has already fallen out of use. In this township, on the western side, the earig still happens, and the older women still know the small turf sheilings on the moor where their mothers and grandmothers spent the summers of their own girlhood. The Gaelic is up at first light. She has packed, in a small wooden box on a low cart, the things that will be needed at the shailing. There is the small iron pot for cooking. There is the wooden quern for churning butter. There is the small wooden tub for setting the milk. There is a small bag of oatmeal. There is a small flitch of dried fish from last autumn's herring. There is a bundle of dry peats wrapped in sacking to start the fire on the first night before they have gathered fresh peats from the moor. There is a single woolen blanket each. The cart, which is no more than a flat wooden platform on two small wheels, is hitched to the small shaggy Highland pony that the croft keeps for such work. The pony, a small red-brown beast called Mary, stands patiently, her breath rising in the cool morning air, while the Gaelic and her daughter-in-law load the small things on the cart and tie them down. The cattle are then brought out of the byre. The two cows have spent the winter in the dim, warm byre, on the deep straw, and they come out into the bright morning light blinking and slow. They are followed by a third cow, the Gaelic's son's brother's cow, who is being sent up to the same shailing with this family, by the long, pleasant custom of the township, by which neighbors share the summer pastures, and the women take turns watching the joint herds. The cattle, once out in the yard, lift their heads, snuff the air, and seem to know in some slow cattle way where they are going. The Gaelic takes the lead rope of the first cow. Her daughter-in-law takes the second. The small daughter, who is going with them for her first summer at the shailing, takes the rope of the third, although the cow is well used to the work and would walk by herself. The small son and the man of the croft stay behind. The man will work the croft through the summer. The small son is too young for the moor and stays with his father. There will be visits in the long summer evenings, the men walking up to the shailing with letters or news, the women coming down to the croft for a few days with the butter and the cheese they have made. They set off in the soft morning light, along the small track that runs from the back of the croft, past the small lochen and up onto the moor. The track is no more than a path, worn into the peaty ground by generations of cattle and ponies and the bare feet of women, winding between the small hummocks of heather and the small pools of black water. The cattle walk slowly, in the slow, patient way of cattle, snuffing the new grass at the edges of the track, stopping now and then for a brief taste, urged on by a soft word from the woman behind them. The Gaelic walks at the head of the small procession. She is wearing her thick dark woolen skirt with the white linen apron over it, her shawl pulled close against the morning cool, her stout leather boots making a soft, heavy sound on the peaty path. Her daughter-in-law walks behind her in the same kind of dress. The small daughter walks behind, holding her rope, her face bright with the great adventure of going to the shailing for the first time. The pony Mary walks at the back, drawing the small cart with its small load of summer goods. They walk for nearly 2 hours slowly in the soft morning light, up the long, slow climb from the croft onto the high moor. The light grows. The sun rises higher in the southeast. The sea, behind them, falls away into the distance until it is only a long pale band along the western edge of the world. The land around them changes from the soft greens of the Inby to the soft browns and purples of the high moor, with the small white tufts of bog cotton everywhere on the wet places, and the small red flowers of the cuckoo flower in the soft places by the burns. They come at last to the shaling. The shaling itself is a small turf and stone hut, oval in plan, perhaps 12 feet long and 7 feet wide, with low walls of stacked stone and turf, and a low roof of turf laid over a frame of rough timber and topped with a thick layer of heather. There is a single low doorway. There is no window. There is no chimney, only a small gap in the roof where the smoke of the peat fire can find its way out. The inside is dim and earthy and very small. There is a stone hearth at the back, with the ashes of last summer's last fire still on it. There is a small turf bench around the inside of the wall, where the women will sit and sleep. There is a small wooden shelf set into the stone wall, where the wooden vessels for the milk will live for the next 4 months. The Gaelic is the first into the shaling. She stoops at the low doorway, steps in, looks around in the dim light and nods. The shaling is sound. The walls have held the winter. The roof has held the winter. The hearth is dry. She comes out, and she and her daughter-in-law begin the slow, patient work of opening the summer house for the season. They sweep the floor with a small bundle of dry rushes. They lay the bundle of dry peats by the hearth. They unload the cart. They settle the small wooden vessels on the shelf. They lay the woolen blankets on the turf benches. The cattle, meanwhile, have already begun to graze the soft new grass around the shaling. They move slowly, in the slow, patient way of cattle, in the bright morning light. The sun is now well up. The wind on the moor is soft. The small fresh smell of the new heather and the new grass is in the air. The cuckoo is calling, somewhere over toward the loch, the soft hollow note that says properly that the summer is here. The Gaelic lights the first peat fire of the season in the small stone hearth, with a single ember she has carried up from the croft fire in a small clay box wrapped in moss. The small fire catches and lifts a thin column of pale blue peat smoke up through the gap in the roof. The smell of peat smoke, warm and sweet, fills the small shaling. The Gaelic sits down on the turf bench by the fire, her hands quiet in her lap, and looks at her daughter-in-law and her granddaughter and smiles. The summer has begun. The cows are on the moor. The fire is lit. There is nowhere else to be. Stay with them in the small turf hut on the high moor, with the peat smoke rising and the cattle quiet on the new grass. Let your breath go long. It is June now on the Isle of Lewis, and the long light has come. The latitude of Lewis is 58 degrees north, which is further north than Moscow, further north than the southern tip of Greenland, further north than almost any land in the inhabited world that is not the very edge of Scandinavia or Russia. At this latitude, in the weeks around midsummer, the sun does not so much set as soften out of sight behind the long, flat western horizon, leaving a wide, pale band of light along the whole northern rim of the world that does not go entirely dark all night. The Lewis crofters call it the simmer dim, the summer dim, the soft half-light that holds the island from late May until late July, the long Hebridean dusk that is not quite night. We are out on the moor at the shaling. It is late evening, perhaps 10 o'clock, perhaps a little later. The Gaelic and the daughter-in-law and the small daughter have finished their evening work at the shaling, the milking and the setting of the new milk in the cool stone vessels, and they have stepped out of the low doorway into the long, soft Hebridean evening to sit, for a quiet hour, on the turf bench outside the shaling wall. The light around them is the color of the inside of a pearl. The sun has gone down half an hour ago behind the long flat western horizon, but the whole sky is still pale, with a warm soft gold along the northwest, fading up to a soft pearl blue overhead and a deeper soft blue, almost grey in the east. There are no stars. There will not be stars properly for another 6 weeks. The night on Lewis in June does not get dark enough for stars. The cattle are settled on the moor. They are lying down, 3 soft dark shapes against the soft pale heather, perhaps 100 yards from the shaling, where they have moved to of their own choosing for the night. The pony Mary is lying down a little further off. The small dog, a soft black collie that came up with the daughter-in-law on her last visit to the croft and stayed, is lying at the Gaelic's feet. And out from somewhere in the heather, perhaps 50 yards behind the shaling, the corncrake is calling. The corncrake is a small brown bird, the size of a thrush, that lives in the long grass and the rough hay meadows of the Hebrides. In 1900, on Lewis, it is a common bird. It is heard everywhere through the summer evenings, in every township, on every moor. Its call is unmistakable. It is a slow, rasping crack-crack, 2 notes, drawn out, repeated with patient regularity, like the slow drawing of a small saw through soft wood. The bird itself is almost never seen. It calls from deep in the long grass, walking slowly, hidden, only the call coming out into the air. The corncrake at this hour, behind the shaling, has been calling slowly for the past half hour. Crek, crek, pause, crek, crek, pause, the slow, patient rhythm of a bird that has all night and has nothing else to do. The Gaelic, sitting on the turf bench, listens to it the way she has listened to corncrakes every June of her 60 years. A little nearer, in the heather, the small evening sounds of the moor are going on. A snipe is drumming, somewhere up in the soft pearl sky, the strange humming whirring sound that the male snipe makes by spreading his tail feathers in his display dive. A redshank is calling at the edge of the loch, the long thin whistle that lifts and falls. A pair of greylag geese, very far off, are flying low across the moor in the soft light, their long necks stretched out, their wings making the slow, steady creak of geese flying. The daughter-in-law has brought out a small wooden bowl of crowdy, the soft, fresh cheese that she has made from the morning's milk, and a small piece of barley bread. The 3 of them eat slowly, in the soft, long light, sitting on the turf bench, the small daughter leaning sleepily against her mother's side. When they have eaten, the Gaelic begins to talk, in the soft, careful Gaelic that is the language of the whole island, the language of the cradle and the deathbed and every conversation in between. She is telling the small daughter, in a slow, patient way that knows the child is half asleep, an old story, a Dulached, one of the long stories of the Fianna, of Fionn Mac Cumhale and his warriors, of how Fionn caught the salmon of knowledge and ate of it and knew all things. The story is one of the old stories of the Western Gaelic world, told round many fires in many shalings for many hundreds of years. The Gaelic knows it, as her mother knew it, and tells it now in the slow way of a grandmother whose voice is itself part of the medicine of the long evening. While she talks, in the long soft light, the man of the croft comes walking slowly up the path from the township. He has walked the 4 miles from the croft after his evening's work. He is wearing his everyday clothes, a heavy dark jacket against the evening cool, his cap pushed back on his head. He carries, in one hand, a small cloth bundle, in which is a small piece of dried fish and a folded letter that has come for the daughter-in-law from her cousin who has gone to Glasgow for work. He has come up to bring these things and to spend the evening and to walk back down to the croft in the soft long light before the dim properly comes on. He comes to the shaling and sits down on the turf bench beside his mother and accepts a small wooden cup of milk from his wife and listens for a little while to the slow telling of the story. And then he and his mother begin a slow, quiet conversation in the same soft Gaelic about the work on the croft, about the price of the wool at Stornoway, about the news that has come up from the south. A little after midnight, in the still soft light, he stands and stretches and says good night and walks back down the long path toward the township. The small dog stands and watches him until he is out of sight behind the first low ridge. The Gaelic and the daughter-in-law and the small daughter, who is by now properly asleep with her head in her mother's lap, sit on for a little longer in the soft long light. The light, even now, in the small hour after midnight, is enough to see by. The hills to the east are showing as soft dark shapes against the pearl-coloured sky. The cattle on the moor are visible as soft dark lumps against the pale heather. The water of the small loch a quarter of a mile away is showing as a soft silver disk against the dark moor. The thin column of pale blue peat smoke from the shaling fire is rising straight up into the still air. The Gaelic speaks quietly of the eggs. The next morning, she says, in her careful, slow Gaelic, the daughter-in-law and the small daughter might walk down to the cliffs at the western edge of the township, to the rocky headland where the seabirds nest, and look for the eggs of the guillemots and the kittiwakes. June, in the long bright days of midsummer, is the season for gathering eggs from the cliffs. It is dangerous work. The cliffs of Lewis fall sheer to the sea, in places 200 feet, and the eggs lie on the narrow ledges where the birds have laid them. A man with a rope around his waist and a strong helper at the top can go down and gather 100 eggs in a morning. A woman, working carefully on the easier ledges that can be reached without ropes, can gather perhaps a dozen in a quiet hour. The Gaelic speaks of this slowly, with the soft caution of a woman who has known of those who fell. She speaks of how to test the ledges before stepping. She speaks of how to listen for the loose stone. She speaks of how, in her own girlhood, she had gathered eggs on the ledges at Mangestad with her own mother. The small daughter is properly asleep now. The corncrake is still calling in its slow, patient rhythm. The light is still pale gold along the northwest. The sea, far off and below, is still showing its soft silver. The slow, long Hebridean midsummer evening is doing its long, quiet work. Stay with them in the soft, pale light, on the turf bench outside the shaling, with the corncrake calling slowly in the heather and the snipe drumming softly overhead, and let the long Hebridean dusk hold you. There is nothing to do tonight. The summer is at its longest light. The bird is calling. The cattle are quiet. The story is half told. Let your breath go long. It is July now on the Isle of Lewis, and the peat cutting has begun. The peat, on Lewis as on every island and most of the mainland of the Western Highlands, is the fuel of the year. Coal is hardly known on the island. There are no trees, and so there is no firewood worth the name. The whole heating and cooking of every house on the island through the long Hebridean winter is done with peat. And the peat must be cut in July when the weather is at its driest, and the long days give the cut peats the best chance to dry on the bank before the autumn rains come. The peat bank of this croft is on the high moor, perhaps 1.5 miles from the township, on a stretch of deep, dark peat that the township has shared by long custom for many generations. Each croft has its own allotment along the bank, marked by small stones, and each crofter cuts his peats from his own length, working back into the bank a little further each year. The peat itself is the deep, dark vegetable matter of the moor, accumulated over many thousands of years from the slow rotting of mosses and grasses in the wet, acid soil. It is dense and dark, almost black where it is deepest, the color and texture of soft chocolate, with a smell, when it is freshly cut, of damp earth and ancient leaves, and something faintly resinous and faintly sweet. When it is dried, in the long process that takes most of the summer, it becomes light and dry and crumbles easily in the hand, with a fibrous structure that holds the shape of the slow-rotted plants that made it. When it is burned in a Lewis hearth, it makes the soft, warm smoke, blue-gray and slightly sweet, that is the unmistakable smell of a Hebridean house. The cutting of the peat is the work of 2 people or 3. One stands above, on the firm ground at the top of the bank, with the paytyon, the long-handled iron blade that cuts the peat from the bank. One stands below, at the foot of the cut, taking each cut peat as it falls and laying it carefully on the dry heather to the side, building up the long line of fresh peats that will be left there to begin their slow drying. A third, if there is a third, walks the cut peats further out onto the moor and stacks them in the small open stacks called rudhane that are built to let the wind through, to dry them more thoroughly through the rest of the summer. The man of the croft is on the bank now, with the paytyon in his hands. He has come up from the croft in the cool of the early morning, before the sun is properly hot, with his cap pulled low against the soft early light. He is wearing his rough working trousers tucked into his stout leather boots, and a heavy linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up above his elbows, and the soft sweat of an hour's steady work is on his forehead. Beside him, helping at the foot of the cut, is his neighbor, the man from the next croft, who has come over for the day in the long, quiet way that crofters help each other at the peats, knowing that next week the help will be returned at the neighbor's bank. The work is steady and slow. The paytyon, with its long handle and its wide, thin iron blade, is set carefully against the face of the cut, perhaps 8 inches in from the previous cut. The man on the bank presses down, with his foot on the wooden tread at the side of the blade, and the blade slices down through the peat with a small soft sound, almost a sigh. The cut peat, A rectangular block, perhaps a foot long and 4 inches wide and 4 inches deep, falls clean from the bank. The neighbor below takes it, turns it gently in his hands, and lays it on the dry heather beside the bank, neat in its line with the others. The man on the bank steps a hand's breadth along the cut, and the blade goes in again, and another cut peat falls. And another, and another. The slow, even rhythm of peat cutting is the slow, even rhythm of all good handwork, the rhythm that a man can keep up for hours, the rhythm that has nothing to do with hurry. It is the same rhythm as the cascrome turning the lazy bed, the same rhythm as the spade in a vegetable garden, the same rhythm as a hammer on a small anvil. The body, once it has found the rhythm, will keep the rhythm for as long as the day requires. By mid-morning, when the sun has come up properly, the two men have cut a long stretch of bank and built a long line of fresh peats on the heather beside it. The line is perhaps 100 peats long, dark and damp and heavy, glistening slightly in the morning sun. A little before noon, the daughter-in-law arrives, walking up the path from the township with a small basket on her arm. In the basket is the men's piece, the small meal that is brought out to the workers in the field at noon. There is a small loaf of fresh barley bread baked that morning on the kitchen griddle. There is a small piece of crowdy, the fresh cheese made yesterday at the shaling. There is a small flask of weak ale. There is a small bottle of strong sweet tea, kept warm in a piece of folded sacking, which is the new fashion in 1900 and is taking its place beside the older ale. The men come down from the bank. They sit on the dry heather beside the line of fresh peats. They eat slowly in the soft midday light, in the way of men who have done a morning's work and have an afternoon ahead. The daughter-in-law sits with them for a little while, then stands, gathers her empty basket, and walks back down the path to the township. The smell on the moor at this hour of the peat cutting is the deep, dark smell of the freshly cut peat. It is the smell of old wet earth, the smell of the long-rotted plants of many centuries, the smell of the deep moor open to the air for the first time. It is mixed, at this distance, with the smell of the warm heather in the sun, the small, dry, resinous smell that the heather gives off when the summer sun has warmed it through. And underneath both, very faintly, is the soft, sweet, thin smell of the small white tufts of bog cotton in the wet places along the bank. After the noon meal, the work begins again. The cutting, this time, is interspersed with the lifting of yesterday's cut peats, which have lain on the heather for a full day and are beginning, very slightly, to firm. The neighbor takes each one in his hands, turns it carefully, lays it gently back on the heather with its damper side up, so that the drying sun and wind can begin to work on the new face. This is the first of many turnings. The peats will be turned at intervals over the next 2 weeks. After that, when they are firm enough to hold their shape, they will be lifted into the small open stacks, the rudhane, where they will sit through August and into early September, drying slowly in the wind off the Atlantic. The afternoon goes slowly. The sun climbs to its high point in the south, then begins very slowly to slip down toward the west. The two men work on in the slow, even rhythm of the pattern, the cut, the lift, the lay, the small step along the bank. The line of fresh peats grows longer. The breeze, which has been soft all morning, begins to pick up a little in the afternoon, lifting the small white tufts of bog cotton and ruffling the small dark heather. A few hundred yards away, on the next bank, a single skylark is singing. The song is the long bubbling cascade of a skylark in full song on a summer afternoon, lifting and lifting in the high air. The men on the bank do not look up. They have heard skylarks every July of their lives, but the song is there in the soft, warm air, the small, bright thread of sound that goes with the slow work of the peats. By evening, when the sun has come down toward the west, and the long shadows are stretching out from the small rudhane that they have started to build, the two men have done a full day. They have cut perhaps 300 peats. They have laid them in their long lines. They have begun the slow work of building the first small drying stacks. They lean their peat irons against the side of one of the rudhane, gather their jackets, and begin the slow walk down the path back to the township, in the soft, warm light of the late summer afternoon, with the smell of the peat still strong on their hands and the small dark line of the cut bank behind them. Stay with them in the slow, warm afternoon on the high moor, with the skylark singing and the peat iron at rest, and the long line of fresh peats glistening in the sun. There is nowhere else to be. It is August now, on the small croft on the western side of the Isle of Lewis. The air has changed in the past 2 weeks from the soft, warm air of midsummer to the slightly sharper, drier air of late summer, with the first faint hint of the coming autumn at the edges of it. The corncrake has stopped calling. The cuckoo has stopped calling. The skylarks are still singing, but not as steadily as they were in July. The light is shorter at each end of the day. The sun goes down now properly behind the western sea, and the long simmer dim has begun, very gently, to give way to the proper darkness of evening. And the small hay crop of the croft, the precious thin grass that has been growing on the Inby ground since the cattle were taken away to the shalings in early May, is now ready to be cut. The hay of a Lewis croft is not much, by the standards of the lowland farms. There are no broad fields. There is only a single small piece of the Inby ground, perhaps half an acre, that has been left ungrazed and unworked through the summer, allowed to grow its thin sweet grass and its small soft heads of clover into the standing crop that will be cut now, dried in the wind, and stored in a small stack at the end of the croft to feed the cows through the long winter. The crop by lowland measure is small. By Lewis measure it is essential. Without the small stack of hay at the end of the croft, the cows would not eat properly through the months when there is no grazing on the Inby and the byre is their only home. Without the cows eating properly, there would be no milk, no calves, no butter, no cheese, no winter sustenance. So the hay, however small, is cut with the same care that a great lowland farmer would give a 100-acre field. The cutting is done with the scythe. The scythe is a long-handled tool with a long, thin, curved blade of polished steel set at an angle to the wooden handle and 2 short hand grips along the shaft. The man of the croft has his scythe ready. The blade was sharpened by him and by his father before him over many winter evenings on a small whetstone by the kitchen fire, and it carries the deep, keen edge that a well-kept scythe holds. He goes into the small hay meadow in the cool of the early morning, before the sun has dried the dew from the grass. Hay is cut, by long custom, when the grass is still slightly damp with the morning dew. The dew softens the stems and lets the blade cut clean. By midday, when the dew is gone, the cutting is harder. By afternoon, with the grass dry and brittle, the cutting will damage the grass and waste the cut. The man stands at the edge of the meadow. He lifts the scythe. He sets the blade at the right angle to the ground, almost flat, with the heel of the blade just barely above the soil. He begins the long, slow, even sweep that is the only way to use a scythe properly. The whole body from the hips turns in a slow, patient half circle, the blade sweeping through the standing grass at ground level, the cut grass falling neatly in a long, even line, the swathe on the man's left. The blade goes through the grass with the soft hissing sound that a sharp scythe makes, a sound like a long-drawn breath, like a small wave drawing back on shingle, like a soft cloth being drawn slowly through water. The cut grass falls. The man steps forward half a pace. The scythe goes back, the body turns, the blade sweeps through again. The next swathe of cut grass falls beside the last. It is slow work, and it is steady work, and it is work that asks the whole body to move together. A man who knows the scythe can cut a small meadow in a morning and feel afterwards only the soft, pleasant tiredness of the long, even movement, not the burning ache of poor technique. The man on this croft has been using the scythe since he was 16 years old. His body knows the movement. He works slowly along the meadow, the swathes of cut grass falling neatly behind him, the line of his cutting straight and even. By mid-morning, he has cut perhaps a third of the meadow. The women come out then with the long-handled wooden hay rakes that have been kept in the barn through the year. The Gaelic is here, having come down from the shaling for the hay week, and the daughter-in-law and an older neighbour, an aunt of the daughter-in-law who has come over from her own croft to help. The four of them, 3 women and the small daughter who is now carrying a smaller rake of her own, begin to turn the swathes. Hay drying is the slow, patient work that turns cut grass into stored fodder. The cut swathes, lying flat on the ground, would mould if left as they were. They must be turned, lifted, spread, turned again, day after day, in the warm, dry summer wind, until the moisture is out of the grass, and the color has changed from the bright green of the cut to the soft, pale gold of dry hay. The women work along the swathes with their rakes, lifting the grass, turning it, spreading it loose, in the slow, even rhythm of women who have done this work every August of their lives. The rake handles are smooth in their hands. The light is bright. The wind is soft. The dry grass smells of the warm meadow, the sweet hay smell that is one of the great smells of the agricultural year. A soft, warm, grassy smell with a faint floral note from the small heads of clover and the small white heads of yarrow that have been growing in among the grass. They work in a loose line, talking quietly in their soft Gaelic as they go. The Gaelic is in the middle of a long, slow story about an aunt of her own who once lost a calf in the August storm of 1868. The daughter-in-law and the older neighbor listen as they rake, putting in a word now and then. The small daughter follows along with her small rake, doing very little work, but feeling, in the slow, important way of a small child, that she is part of the great task of getting in the hay. By the middle of the afternoon, the man has finished the cutting. The whole meadow lies in long, even swathes, the cut grass pale green against the darker stubble. He stands at the edge of the meadow with the scythe in his hand, looks at the work, nods slowly, and turns the scythe carefully so that the keen blade is away from the body, and walks slowly back to the byre to set it in its place against the wall, ready for tomorrow. The women work on into the late afternoon. The hay turns slowly under their rakes. The sun moves slowly across the western sky. The wind, which has been soft all day, begins to pick up a little in the late afternoon, lifting the loose pale grass and giving it the second slow drying that will bring it on. By evening, when the sun has come down to the line of the horizon, the meadow is a soft sea of pale green and yellow, the cut grass spread loose across the whole surface, the swathes broken and turned and ready for the morning's further work. The women stop, lean on their rakes and look at it. The Gaelic speaks in her quiet Gaelic the small word of satisfaction. It is a good first day. The weather has held. The grass has turned well. The wind has been kind. They walk slowly back toward the house, 4 figures across the soft meadow in the long evening light, with the small daughter trotting between them, dragging her small rake. From the chimney of the Taig Tughaid, a thin column of pale blue peat smoke is rising slowly into the evening air. The man is at the door of the house, looking out, with the small son standing beside him, both of them watching the women come in across the meadow in the long, warm light. There is still much work to do. The hay must be turned again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. It must, after a few days more, be gathered into the small loose heaps called cocks, and then the cocks must be watched for rain. And if rain comes, the cocks must be broken open, and the grass turned again, and then recocked. Only after another full week, perhaps 2, will the hay be properly dry and ready to be lifted into the small stack at the end of the croft. But the cutting is done. The slow, long August work of the hay has begun properly. The small, precious crop is on its way to the byre. The cows, who do not yet know it, are being fed for the winter. Stay with them in the soft, warm evening of the August meadow, with the pale grass under their feet and the slow peat smoke rising and the long light fading toward the west. Let your breath go long. It is September now, on the small croft on the western side of the Isle of Lewis. The light has shortened properly. The sun rises later, comes up over the moor behind the township in soft pink and gold, and sets earlier, going down behind the western sea in a long, slow blaze of orange and copper. The wind off the Atlantic has begun to carry, on some mornings, the first faint cold edge of autumn. The grass on the moor is beginning to turn from the soft greens of the summer to the soft russets and pale yellows of the autumn. The heather, in patches, is in its full purple flower, and the moor at this hour looks like a vast slow sea of dark purple and dark green stretching out to the eastern horizon. And on the croft, the harvest of the small grain crop is now underway. The barley field of this croft is a small one, perhaps 1/4 of an acre, on the Inby ground at the southern end of the croft. It has been growing slowly through the summer, sown in late April when the lazy beds were planted with potatoes, and now in early September the stalks have ripened to the soft pale gold of full barley, the small grain heads heavy and curving slightly under their own weight. There is also a small drill of oats at the northern end of the croft, perhaps 1/8 of an acre, sown for the family's porridge meal through the winter. The cutting of the barley is done with the sickle. The sickle is the small, short-handled, curved blade, much smaller than the scythe, that is the traditional grain-cutting tool of the Western Islands. It is held in one hand, while the other hand gathers the standing barley into a small handful, and the small curved blade is drawn across the bottom of the stalks in a quick, clean cut. The handful of cut barley is laid down on the ground, the cutter steps forward, and the next handful is gathered and cut. It is slow work, slower even than the scythe in the hay, but on the small uneven fields of a Lewis croft, with the boulders showing through and the soil thin and the field corners awkward, the sickle is the tool that works. It can be used on a slope. It can be used in a corner. It can be used right up against a wall. The scythe, with its long sweep, cannot. The whole family is in the barley field this morning. The man of the croft is at the lade. The daughter-in-law and the Gaelic are behind him, gathering the cut handfuls and tying them into the small sheaves that will be set up in stooks in the field. The small daughter and the small son, who is now perhaps 7 and is allowed to do small tasks at the harvest, are working behind the women, gathering up the loose stalks that have fallen, the gleaning that will not be wasted. The man works in the slow, careful rhythm of the sickle. The small curved blade flashes briefly in the morning light. The cut bunch falls. The blade is back. Another bunch is gathered, another cut. His left hand, which gathers the standing barley, moves with the soft, careful precision of long habit. His right hand, which holds the sickle, moves with the same precision. The barley falls in a small, even rhythm onto the stubble behind him. Behind him, the daughter-in-law and the Gaelic gather. They take up the cut handfuls, line them up neatly so that the cut ends are level and the grain heads are all the same way, and they bind them with a small twist of barley straw at the middle. The bound sheaves are set down beside the line of cutting, and as the line of sheaves grows, the small son comes along behind and stands the sheaves up in groups of 6 or 8, leaned against each other, the small standing groups called stooks that will let the wind through them and dry the cut grain on the field. By the middle of the morning, the men of 2 neighboring crofts have come over to help. This is the custom of the harvest help, the daily lending of hands between the crofts of the township that gets the small fields in. The neighbor's wife has come too, and brought with her a small basket of fresh barley bread and a small flask of buttermilk for the breaks. The line of cutters and binders, with the help in, moves more steadily down the field. The sound of the harvest is the soft rhythmic swish of the sickle in the standing barley, the small soft sound of cut stalks falling, the soft swish of the cut sheaves being bound and lifted, the soft small clack of the standing stooks being set, and over all of it, the soft conversation of the family and the neighbors in the easy, slow Gaelic of an ordinary harvest day. The light in early September is the soft, warm gold of the late summer, with the long shadows already stretching from the stooks across the stubble in the cool morning air. The smell on the field is the smell of cut barley, a clean, dry, slightly grassy smell with a soft, sweet undernote of the ripe grain. The breeze is soft off the sea. By the middle of the afternoon, the small field is cut. The whole quarter-acre is now stubble, with the long lines of small standing stooks running across it in the soft afternoon light. The man stands at the edge of the field with the sickle in his hand, looking at the work, nodding slowly. The Gaelic is sitting on a small stone at the edge, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the stooks with the long, quiet satisfaction of a woman who has helped to take in many harvests on this same small piece of ground. In the evening, when the men have come down from the field and the women have set the cooking on for the supper, the small kern supper of the croft is held. The kern supper, called also the Melandale, is the small modest harvest celebration of the Western Highland croft. It is not the great festival of the lowland farms. It is a small evening meal, eaten in the kitchen of the croft, with a slightly better meal than usual and a small dram of whisky for the men, to mark the gathering of the year's grain and to thank the neighbours who have come over with their help. There is on the rough oak table a small portion of boiled mutton from a sheep slaughtered that morning, with potatoes and turnips from the croft. There is beside each plate a small piece of fresh oatcake. There is on the wooden dresser a small earthenware jar of the family's small whisky, which is the still that the bodach of the croft and one or two of the neighbours keep very quietly in a small turf hut up in a corner of the moor where the excise men have never quite found their way. The making of the small whisky still on Lewis in 1900 is technically illegal. The Excise Act has long since required all distilling to be licensed, and the great commercial distilleries of the Highlands are all licensed and taxed. But on the islands, in the small townships, the practice of keeping a small home still for the family's own use has continued in a quiet way that everyone knows about and no one talks about. The excise officers, who visit Stornoway and sometimes the larger villages, do not often come up into the small townships, and when they do, they tend to find that all the local stills, of which they know nothing, have unaccountably been swept clean in the previous week. The whisky from the small home stills is not the smooth, aged spirit of the great distilleries. It is rough, raw, strong, peat-smoked, drunk fresh from the still without aging, and a small dram of it is sufficient to warm a man through a long evening. The whisky is poured into small wooden cups. The men sitting along the bench at the table lift their cups, and the bodach, the old grandfather of the croft, who has been mostly silent through the supper, says a short, slow toast in Gaelic, the sláinte hath the good health that has been said at countless small Hebridean harvest tables for many generations. The men answer sláinte. They drink. The whisky goes down hot and warms the chest and brings a soft, slow smile to the men's faces. Outside, the long evening of early September is coming on, the soft, warm gold of the late afternoon giving way to the deeper orange and copper of the sunset, and behind the kitchen window, the small stooks of the new barley are standing in their long, even lines on the cut field. The harvest is in. The neighbours have helped. The slow, long year of growing has produced its small, precious crop. Stay with them in the warm kitchen, with the small, slow burn of the peat fire in the hearth and the soft, slow Gaelic of the harvest supper at the table, and the small standing stooks visible through the window in the soft evening light. Let your breath go long. It is October now on the Isle of Lewis, and we have come down from the small croft on the western side and walked across the island in our imagination to the eastern coast, to the small fishing harbour at the head of one of the long sheltered sea locks that cut into the east of Lewis from the Minch. Here, in October of 1900, the great work of the year is the herring fishery. The herring of the Minch is a vast, slow-moving silver fish, the size of a man's hand, that shoals in great numbers in the cold, deep waters between Lewis and the mainland of Scotland, and that comes up close to the shore in the autumn in the great runs that the Hebridean fishermen have followed for many hundreds of years. In 1900, the herring fishery is at its high tide. The boats of the eastern Lewis ports, of Stornoway and of Habost and of Scigister, and of the small harbour where we are now standing, are out every night the weather allows, drifting the long curtain walls of net through the cold, dark water, and bringing the silver crop home in the soft early morning to the curing stations on the shore. We are standing on the small stone pier of the harbour. It is just after sunset. The light in the west, behind the dark line of the hills above us, is the deep red-orange of an October sunset, with a few low ragged clouds catching the last of the light along their lower edges. The sea loch in front of us is the soft slate grey of evening, with the slow swell of the open sea coming gently in past the rocky outer points and lifting the small boats at the pier. There are perhaps a dozen boats at the pier and another half-dozen at moorings in the loch. They are the type of boat called the Zulu, the most common Lewis fishing boat of this period, a heavy single-masted lug-rigged boat, perhaps 40 feet long, with a wide, deep hull built to hold the long drift nets and the heavy catches, and to ride out the sudden weather of the Minch when it comes. The hulls are painted black, with white above the waterline. The masts are tarred. The sails, hauled down now at the pier, are heavy brown canvas, stiff with sea salt and with the herring oil that gets onto everything around this work. The men of the boats are on the pier and on the decks, preparing for the night's fishing. They are wearing the heavy oilskin smocks and trousers that are the universal sea clothing of the Hebridean fishermen, the soft, pale yellow garments greased with linseed oil and tar against the salt water, with thick wool jerseys underneath, and stout leather sea boots on their feet. Their caps are pulled low. Their hands, calloused from years of hauling nets, are quick and sure on the work of the boats. On the deck of the nearest Zulu, 4 men are working over the great pile of folded drift net that fills the central part of the boat. The drift net is a long, thin curtain of fine cotton mesh, perhaps 50 yards long and 10 feet deep, with corks along the top edge to keep it floating and small lead weights along the bottom edge to keep it hanging straight down in the water. The boats of the eastern Lewis ports will set perhaps a mile of such net each night, joined end to end in the long drifting wall that the herring shoals swim into in the dark. The men, with quick practiced hands, are checking the net for tears, mending small holes with small wooden netting needles wound with cotton twine, folding the corks neatly along the top, settling the weights. The 5th man of the boat, the skipper, is on the pier, looking at the sky in the soft last light, gauging the wind, gauging the swell, deciding whether the night will be a good night. He decides it will. He turns to his crew, calls a single soft word in Gaelic, and they begin to make ready to sail. The mooring is cast off. The single great lugsail is hauled up the mast in slow, heavy hauls, the heavy brown canvas catching the soft evening wind and bellying out into the slow curve of full sail. The boat begins to move very slowly away from the pier, the small wake of her passage catching the last of the orange light from the western sky. The four other men of the crew are at the oars, at the foot of the mast, helping her head into the wind for the long, slow tack down the lock toward the open sea. We do not go with them. We stand on the pier and watch the boat go. She moves down the lock slowly in the soft, fading light, her dark hull and her tall brown sail silhouetted against the deeper darkness of the eastern sky. Behind her, the other boats are casting off too, one by one, in the slow, patient way of a fleet getting under way. There is no haste. The wind is soft. The night is long. The herring will come, or will not, in the deep, cold water out beyond the headlands, and the boats will be there to meet them. The gulls are still calling over the harbour. There are hundreds of them, herring gulls and great black-backed gulls, wheeling slowly in the last of the light, calling the way that gulls always call around a fishing harbour, the long, thin cries and the small, soft barks. They will be here all night, in the soft glow of the few oil lamps that mark the pier and the curing sheds, waiting for the morning return of the boats and the spillings and offcuts of the gutting work. The curing sheds, behind us at the head of the pier, are where the herring will be brought when the morning comes. They are long, low buildings of stone and timber, with thatched or slated roofs, and with the great salting tubs along their inner walls. The smell of the curing sheds is the strong, rich, slightly sweet smell of cured herring, a smell of salt and fish and slow brining that gets into the walls and the timbers and the very clothes of the men and women who work there, and that hangs over a Lewis fishing port from the first day of October to the last day of November in the great years of the fishery. The gutting and salting of the herring is the work of the women by long custom. The herring gutters, the gutting girls, are a famous body of working women on the western coast of Scotland and the east coast of Britain. They are mostly young women in their late teens and early 20s who travel from port to port through the season following the boats. In 1900, the herring gutters of Lewis number in the hundreds, and they will gut in a single morning after a good night's catch, perhaps 100,000 fish. At this hour, just before the boats sail, the gutters are not yet at the sheds. They have eaten their evening meal in the small bothies and the boarding houses that have grown up around the curing stations, and they are resting before the long night that lies ahead. When the boats come in the soft early morning, the gutters will come out in their long aprons and their thick wool headscarves, and the slow long work of the morning will begin. The herring will come up from the boats in great wicker creels. They will be tipped onto the long stone gutting tables. The gutters, working in teams of 3, with the small sharp gutting knives flashing in the morning light, will gut and gill and grade each fish in a single swift motion, the offal falling into the small wooden tubs at their feet, the gutted fish going into the larger tubs at the side, the smaller ones graded out for the cheaper sale and the larger ones for the better. A skilled gutter can clean perhaps 60 fish a minute. The work is hard, the work is wet, the work is cold, and the work, by the year 1900, has become the great seasonal employment of the young Hebridean woman, the slow, steady wage that supports a great many crofting families through the long winter. But that is for the morning. At this hour, in the soft orange last light of the October evening, the boats are sailing out slowly in the long, slow line down the lock. The gulls are calling. The pier is quiet. The smell of cured herring and the smell of tar and the smell of the wet stone of the pier is heavy in the air. From somewhere up on the small hill above the harbour, a single peat fire is sending a thin column of pale blue smoke up into the deepening sky. Stay on the pier in the soft fading light and watch the boats go. There are perhaps 20 of them now, dark hulls and tall brown sails strung out down the loch toward the open sea, each one a small floating life, each one going out to the slow, dark, patient work of the night. Let your breath go long. The herring will come or will not. The morning will be early. The slow, long Hebridean year is at its harvest of the silver crop. There is nowhere else to be. It is November now, and we have walked back, in our imagination, from the eastern fishing harbour across the long flat brown moor of Lewis to the small croft on the western side where we began the year. The light has shortened sharply. The sun, at noon, rises only a little way above the southern horizon, and the long, slow shadows of the buildings lie almost the whole length of the croft, even at midday. The wind has changed. It comes now from the northwest, cold and steady, with the salt smell of the open ocean and the first faint cold edge of winter in it. The grass on the croft is going pale. The moor behind is going brown. The sea is the deep slate grey of the late year, and the cattle have come down from the shalings. The work of bringing the cattle home was done a week ago, in the cold, clear weather of early November. The Gaelic and the daughter-in-law walked up to the shaling on a cold, bright morning, gathered the 3 cows from the high grazing where they had spent the summer, took down the small fire irons and the wooden vessels from the shaling shelves, closed the small turf door for the last time of the season, and walked the long, slow walk down off the moor with the cattle following, in the soft, cold light of the late autumn afternoon. The cows were brought into the byre. The wooden vessels were stored in the small back room of the house. The firebox was set on the kitchen shelf. The shaling up on the high moor is empty now, the small turf hut sitting alone in the brown bracken and the dark heather, waiting for next year. The cows in the byre are well. They have come down from the summer in good flesh, their long shaggy coats thicker now for the winter, the deep straw bedding of last winter swept out and replaced with fresh dry straw from the small barn. They will spend the next 6 months here, in the warm, dim byre, fed on the small stack of hay at the end of the croft, and on the small turnip and oatmeal mash that the family will prepare for them each evening. There is a small comfort, in the quiet way of a Lewis crofting family, in knowing that the cows are home for the winter. The cows are the central wealth of the croft, and bringing them home safely is one of the small, slow, important events of the year. There is one more piece of business with the cattle, however, before the long winter properly begins. The annual cattle market at Stornoway is held in the 2nd week of November. The market is the great seasonal meeting of the cattle trade of Lewis, where the crofters bring the surplus stock of the year, the young bullocks and the older cows past their best, to be sold to the drovers from the mainland who will ship them across the Minch to the great cattle markets at Falkirk and Crieff, where they will be sold on to the lowland farmers and the meat trades of the cities. The drovers come up to Stornoway each November from Inverness and from further south, and the small streets of Stornoway, normally a quiet harbour town of 2,000 souls, are full for the week of cattle and drovers and crofters and the slow, patient business of buying and selling. The man of the croft is going to the market this year. He is taking the small black bullock that was born on the croft 2 summers ago, and that has been grazed on the Inby through the spring and the moor through the summer, and is now ready, by his judgment, for the sale. He has hitched the small pony Mary to the small cart this morning, has put his good jacket and his good cap into a small bundle on the cart, has tied the small bullock by a soft rope to the back of the cart, and has set off, in the cold, soft morning light, on the long, slow walk across the island to Stornoway. The walk to Stornoway from the western side of Lewis is perhaps 20 miles. There is a road, the public road that runs across the middle of the island, a single-track tarred road built by the county in the 1870s. The man and his pony and his bullock will walk it slowly, in a single long day, leaving at first light and arriving at the small inn at the edge of Stornoway in the late afternoon. He will spend the night at the inn, sell the bullock the next morning, do a small piece of shopping for the family with the money from the sale, and walk slowly home over the next 2 days, perhaps with a night at the house of a cousin in one of the inland townships. We do not go with him to the market. We stay at the croft. The croft, with the man away, is at the long, slow, quiet work of late autumn. The daughter-in-law is in the kitchen, at the kitchen table, with a small wooden bowl of cleaned potatoes in front of her and a small knife in her hand, preparing the evening's broth. The bowl is small, the knife is small, the work is slow. She works with the patient ease of a woman who has prepared this same broth in this same kitchen on this same table every winter evening for many years. The Gaelic is sitting by the peat fire, in her low wooden chair with the soft sheepskin cushion, with the small wooden spinning wheel in front of her, spinning the wool of the summer's clip into the long, even thread that will go into the winter's weaving. The spinning wheel is a low, simple wheel, the kind common on Hebridean crofts, with a treadle at the foot and a single spindle at the top, and the slow, steady whir of the wheel turning is one of the small, soft sounds of the kitchen on a November afternoon. The Gaelic's hands are slow and sure on the wool. The thread runs out evenly from her fingers down to the spindle, where it is wound on slowly as the wheel turns. The small daughter, who is now 5, is sitting on a low stool by the fire, watching her grandmother spin. She is, in the slow way of a small Hebridean child of this period, learning the work by watching, the long, slow apprenticeship that will, in 5 or 6 years, mean that she sits at her own small wheel and begins to spin her own wool. For now she watches and listens and asks small, slow questions in her soft Gaelic, and the Gaelic answers. The small son, who is now 7, is at the door of the byre, holding the lead rope of one of the cows, while the daughter-in-law's young brother, who is at the croft for the day, checks the cow's hoof for a small soft spot that has been noticed in the last few days. The check is patient and careful. The cow stands quietly, her great calm patient eye looking at the boy, her breath rising in the cold afternoon air. The young man with the hoof knife works slowly, paring a small thin slice of the hoof to let the soft place breathe. The light in the early afternoon is already beginning to soften toward evening. The sun, low in the south, has begun to slip down toward the western sea. The shadows of the buildings of the croft are very long. The wind off the sea is steady and cold. The smoke from the kitchen chimney is going up in a thin grey-blue column and being bent slightly toward the east by the wind. A single hooded crow, slow and dark, flies low over the croft and lands on the stone wall by the byre. It sits there, hunched against the wind, looking around with its calm, patient eye. The small dog, lying by the byre door, lifts her head, looks at the crow, looks away, lays her head down again. The crow flies off, slow and dark, toward the moor. By the late afternoon, when the sun has gone down behind the western sea, and the soft red-orange of the early winter sunset is fading from the sky, the daughter-in-law has the broth ready in the great iron pot on the hook over the peat fire. The Gaelic has stopped her spinning and has tucked her wool into the small basket at her feet. The small daughter is laying the few wooden bowls on the table for the supper. The small son and his uncle have come in from the byre, having finished the work on the cow's hoof. The kitchen is warm. The peat fire is glowing soft and red. The small oil lamp on the wooden dresser has been lit and throws its small soft yellow circle of light over the table. Outside, the first proper dark of the year is coming down. The long evenings have begun. The cows are home. The peat is in the stack. The hay is in the barn. The grain is in the meal store. The man is on his way to the market. The slow, long work of the inside year, of the winter, of the spinning and the storytelling and the long sitting by the fire is just beginning. Stay with them in the warm, soft kitchen, with the broth ready on the fire and the small lamp lit on the dresser, and the first dark of the November evening pressing soft and slow against the small kitchen window. Let your breath go long. It is December now, on the small croft on the western side of the Isle of Lewis. The dark has come fully down. The sun, on the shortest days of the year, rises only a little above the southern horizon, gives a few hours of pale low light across the brown moor and the grey sea, and slips again behind the western horizon by mid-afternoon. The long evenings are long indeed. By 4 o'clock, the kitchen lamp must be lit. By 5, the dark is full, and the only light on the croft, outside the warm small circle of the lamp inside the house, is the soft glow of the peat fire visible through the small kitchen window and the slow, steady pinpricks of light from the kitchen windows of the neighboring crofts down the township, each one a small, soft, yellow square in the great dark stretching across the moor. But on the last week of December, in the long dark of the shortest days, the township is at its small annual midwinter festival. This is the time of the Duan Caluin, the old Lewis Hogmanay custom, which is celebrated in the days around the change of the year, the days that the Roman calendar calls Christmas and New Year, but that have on Lewis their own deeper, older meaning in the old Gaelic year. There are several practices in the days around the change of the year. There is the Caluin itself, the New Year visiting, when the young men of the township go from house to house in the township, carrying a small dried sheepskin called the Casian Ucht, striking it with a stick at each door and reciting the old verses for the new year. There is the singing of the Duan Caluin at each door, the small old verse song that brings the blessing of the new year on the house. There is, by some practice, the singing of the small Christmas wren's song, the Driolan na Nolage, where the children of the township go from house to house in the days just before the change of the year, carrying a small wren caught in the hedges, or a small carved wooden wren, and singing the small song of the wren for a small gift of bread or money from each house. We are at the croft on the evening of the second last day of the old year. The house is full. The kitchen of the Taig Tughaid is the main room of the house, perhaps 14 feet long and 10 feet wide, with the stone hearth in the middle of one long wall and the small box beds, the cuil, set into the wall opposite. The peat fire is built up high on the hearth. The small iron crook hangs from the wooden beam over the fire, with a great iron pot of broth simmering slowly. The small oil lamp on the wooden dresser is lit. The small tallow candles on the kitchen table are lit. The room is warm in a deep, slow way, with the soft, warm smell of peat smoke and the soft, slow smell of the broth and the small, clean smell of the fresh straw that has been laid on the floor for the visitors. There are perhaps a dozen people in the kitchen, gathered for the evening visiting that is part of the long week of the change of the year. The bodach, the old grandfather of the croft, is in his chair by the fire, his stick at his side, his small clay pipe in his hand. The Gaelic, his wife, is on the small bench beside him. The man of the croft and his wife are at the table. The neighbor from the next croft and his wife are at the table too. The neighbor from across the road is at the table. Two of the young men of the township, sons of other crofts, are sitting on a small bench by the door. The two children of the croft are on a low stool by the fire, with the small daughter of one of the neighbors sitting between them. And the talk is going, slow and easy, in the soft Gaelic of the township, on all the small things of the village and the year. The price of the herring at Stornoway, the man's account of the market and the bullock that sold well, the weather that has been kind so far this December and the weather that the bodach predicts for January. The story of the old woman in the next township over who has died at the great age of 94. The small marriage that is being talked of for the next year between a young man of this township and a young woman of the next. The news of cousins in Glasgow and in Inverness and in distant Cape Breton in Canada, where so many of the people of this island have gone in the last 60 years. In the corner by the door, one of the young men, the elder son of the neighbor from across the road, has a small fiddle on his knee. He has lifted it up now and is, very softly, tuning it. The bodach lifts his head and listens. The Gaelic smiles. The children turn on their stool to watch. The young man begins to play. He plays a slow air, a slow old Gaelic air, one of the old slow tunes of the islands, a tune called something like Keenid na Tri Huia, the lament of the three Marys. Although the air has been played at firesides on these islands for so long that no one is quite sure where it came from or what it was first written for. It is a slow tune. It rises and falls in long, even phrases. It has the soft, mournful sweetness of all the old, slow airs of the Western Gaelic world. The room goes quiet, except for the fiddle. The talk stops. The bodach closes his eyes. The Gaelic looks at the fire. The man of the croft looks at his wife. The children sit very still on the low stool. The peat fire crackles softly on the hearth. The slow air rises and falls in the warm, dim room. When the tune is done, the young man lowers the fiddle and looks at the floor. There is a small silence, the warm, appreciative silence of a Hebridean kitchen at the end of a slow air, and then the bodach speaks, in his slow, careful Gaelic, the small word of thanks, the gun Rob Math argued, and the talk begins again. A little later, when the small tallow candle on the table has burned down to perhaps half its height, there is a soft tap at the kitchen door. The man of the croft gets up and opens the door, and outside in the dark stand three small children of the township, the elder a boy of perhaps 9, and the two younger his sister and a small cousin, with a small piece of sacking wrapped around something in the boy's hands. They have come for the singing of the wren. The boy stands at the door in the small cold air and begins, in a soft, clear voice, the small old wren song. The verses are old. The verses go from house to house with the wren in the days before the change of the year, asking for a small gift in the name of the small bird. The song is in Gaelic. The boy sings perhaps 4 verses in his small, slow, careful voice. His sister and his cousin stand behind him, looking quietly into the warm room. When the song is done, the daughter-in-law of the croft, who has stood up from the table to listen, takes a small piece of fresh bread from the dresser and a small piece of cheese, and gives them to the boy with a small word of thanks. The boy takes them with both hands, says a small careful word of thanks back, and turns and is gone, the small children running off down the dark township road to the next house, the soft sound of their footsteps fading slowly. The man of the croft closes the door, comes back to the table, sits down. The talk picks up again. The fiddle on the bench by the door is silent. The young man with the fiddle has put it down and is now in slow conversation with the Cailleach about an aunt of his who once knew the Cailleach's mother. The night will go on, slow and warm, until the small hours. The talk will go from one slow topic to the next. There will be perhaps another tune. There will be perhaps a small piece of broth eaten from the small wooden bowls. There will be, near midnight, a small dram of the small whiskey, taken slowly by the men only in their small wooden cups. There will be the slow, patient laughter of long-known friends in a warm, dim kitchen on a long winter night. Around them, outside the croft, the great dark of the Hebridean midwinter lies thick over the township and the moor and the sea. The wind, soft from the southwest tonight, moves slowly across the dark land. There are no other sounds. The world outside the soft, warm circle of the kitchen is at its long, quiet rest. Stay with them in the warm, small kitchen with the peat fire glowing on the hearth and the small oil lamp on the dresser and the slow, soft Gaelic of the long winter visiting going on around the table, and let your breath go long. The dark is deep. The fire is good. The neighbors are in. The year is at its turning. There is nowhere else to be. It is January now, on the small croft on the western side of the Isle of Lewis. The year has turned. The old year of 1900 is gone, and the new year of 1901 has begun, although on Lewis the turning of the year is a small, slow thing, and the days afterward look much like the days before. The dark is at its deepest. The days are short. The sun rises, on the longest nights, only at 9 o'clock in the morning and is down again by 3:30 in the afternoon. The land is brown. The moor is brown. The sea is the dark grey slate of midwinter. There is, on the worst days, a thin, cold rain that comes in from the west on the salt wind, and that settles in the small hollows of the land and on the thatched roofs of the houses. But the croft is at the long, slow work of the inside year, which is the slow work of the indoor crafts and the small, slow work of the indoor talk. The work of the inside year is, above all, the work of the wool of the small flock of sheep that the croft keeps on the moor is the central material of the Hebridean household economy. The sheep are sheared in the early summer. The fleeces are washed in the small burn at the back of the croft, in the cold, clean water of the hill streams. They are then teased, the long matted locks pulled apart by hand, the small bits of heather and burr picked out. They are then carded, with the small wooden carding combs that every house has by the fire, the soft fibers combed out in even sheets called rollags. They are then spun, on the small wheel by the fire, into the long even thread that is the basis of all weaving. The Gaelic has spent much of the late autumn at the spinning. The small woolen basket by her chair is full of soft white skeins of new yarn, and beside them are small skeins of yarn that have been dyed in the small kitchen pot with the dye plants that the family keeps and gathers. There is a soft yellow from the lichen on the boulders of the moor, called crottle, which is one of the famous dye plants of the Western Highlands. There is a soft rust red from another lichen, the corker. There is a soft brown from the bark of the alder that grows by the burns. There is a deeper red from the small pieces of madder root that have been carried up to the island by the trading boats from the south. The skeins are bright and soft, and they sit in the basket like small soft sleeping animals of many colors. And now, in the deep dark of January, the Gaelic has set the small loom up by the kitchen wall, and she is beginning the slow, patient work of weaving the new cloth for the year. The loom is a small horizontal loom, the kind common on Hebridean crofts, perhaps 4 feet wide. The warp threads, the long lengthwise threads that form the structure of the cloth, have been set up over the past week, a slow, careful job of measuring and tying. The weft threads, the threads that will be woven across the warp to make the cloth, are wound onto small wooden shuttles, ready for the weaving. The Gaelic sits at the loom on her low wooden stool, with the warp threads stretched out in front of her, and she begins. The work of the loom is the work of the foot and the hand together. The Gaelic presses one foot on the wooden treadle, and the heddles lift half the warp threads up while the other half stays down. She passes the shuttle, with its weft thread, through the small space between the lifted and the lowered warp. She pulls the small wooden beater toward her to push the new weft tightly against the previous weft. She presses the other treadle, the heddles lift the other half of the warp threads, and the shuttle goes back through the open space again. The rhythm of the weaving is slow and steady. The soft click of the heddles, the soft pass of the shuttle through the warp, the soft thump of the beater, the soft pause, the soft click again, the soft pass again, the soft thump. The cloth grows, line by line, in the soft light of the kitchen lamp, the new tweed of the year forming itself slowly in front of the Gaelic's patient hands. The cloth that she is weaving is the small Hebridean tweed, the soft hand-woven wool cloth that has been the universal clothing material of the Western Highlands for many centuries, and that has, in the latter half of the 19th century, become the basis of the Harris tweed industry on the neighboring island of Harris. On Lewis in 1900, much of the weaving is still done at home, for home use. The Gaelic's cloth will be made into a pair of new trousers for the man of the croft, perhaps, and into a new skirt for the small daughter, and into a small shawl for the daughter-in-law, depending on how much is woven and how much is needed. The daughter-in-law is at the kitchen table, in the soft light of the small lamp, sitting with a small wooden bowl of fresh wool in her lap, carding the fibers for the next batch of yarn that her mother-in-law will spin. The carding combs are small flat wooden paddles with hundreds of small metal teeth set into them. A small handful of wool is laid on one comb, and the other comb is drawn slowly across it, the teeth catching the soft fibers and combing them out long and even. After several passes, the fibers are lifted off in a soft, even sheet, the rollag, and laid in a small basket beside her. The work is slow and steady, the way of all good handwork. The daughter-in-law's hands move slowly. The small whisper of the carding combs is one of the soft sounds of the kitchen. The man of the croft is sitting on the low bench by the fire, with a small leather strap across his knees and a small wooden last under it. He is mending a pair of stout leather boots, his own working boots, with a small awl and a length of waxed thread. The boots have worn through at the sole at the back of the heel, and he is patching them with a small piece of new leather cut from a strip he has in the small box at his feet. The work is careful. The awl punches small holes through the new leather and the old. The wax thread, doubled, is drawn through the holes with a small bone needle. The small patch goes on, line by careful line, with the slow patience of a man for whom every pair of boots is a slow, expensive matter to be made to last as long as it possibly can. And the small son, who is now 7 and is at the long, slow apprenticeship of crofting boyhood, is on the floor at his father's feet with a small piece of soft wood and a small knife, slowly whittling at a small wooden boat. The boat is rough and small. The father has shown him, this winter, the slow, careful way of holding the knife, of taking small, slow strokes away from the body, of letting the wood do its own work. The boy is concentrating very hard, his small face serious in the lamplight, the small wood chips falling at his feet. And then, at the head of the kitchen table, in the soft chair with the sheepskin cushion, the bodach, the old grandfather of the croft, who has been silent for a long while looking into the fire, begins to speak. He is the bard of the township, in the small old way that every Hebridean township has its bard, the man who knows the genealogies, who knows the old songs, who knows the old stories, who is the living memory of the family and the village. The bodach is in his late 70s. He has been the bard of this township for 40 years. He learned the stories and the genealogies from his own father, who learned them from his father, in the long unbroken chain that reaches back through the generations. He begins, in his slow, careful Gaelic, to recite the genealogy of the family of the daughter-in-law. He goes back through her mother and her grandmother and her great-grandmother, naming each woman and naming the township she came from and naming the small story or the small saying that the family kept of her. He goes back through her father and her grandfather and her great-grandfather, naming each man and each township and each story. He goes back 5 generations, then 6, then 7. He names a great-great-great-great-grandfather who was a piper to the MacLeods of Lewis in the small wars of the early 1700s. He names a great-great-great-great-grandmother who came as a young bride from the island of Bernera in the year 1690, in the time of the Great Hunger, and who lived to be 93. The voice is slow. The names go by, one after another, in the warm, dim kitchen. The slow weaving of the Gaelic goes on. The slow carding of the daughter-in-law goes on. The slow mending of the man of the croft goes on. The slow whittling of the small son goes on. The slow recitation of the bodach goes on. The peat fire glows soft and red on the hearth. The small lamp throws its small soft yellow circle of light on the table. The dark January night presses soft and slow against the small kitchen window. There is nowhere else to be in a Lewis crofting house on a long January evening. There is the inside work and the inside talk and the long slow keeping of the inside year. Stay with them in the warm dim kitchen with the small click of the loom and the small whisper of the carding comms and the soft voice of the bodach reciting the names of the dead in the soft, slow Gaelic of the island. Let your breath go long. It is February now on the small croft on the western side of the Isle of Lewis. The year has begun to turn back toward the light. The days are noticeably longer than they were at the turn of the year. The sun rises now closer to 8 o'clock and is still up at 4:30 in the afternoon. The light, even on the dull grey days, is a little longer at each end. The dark of the deep midwinter is loosening. The land has not yet woken. The moor is still brown. The grass on the Inby is still pale. The trees, the few small stunted trees that grow in the sheltered hollows of the township, are still bare. The hedges are bare. The lazy beds are still flat and dark, the small ridges showing under the soft winter grass. The sea, off to the west, is still the deep slate grey of the late winter, with the long Atlantic swell rolling slow and even onto the white shell beach below the dunes. But the small signs of the coming turn are there, in the slow, patient way of a Hebridean spring that does not hurry. The hours of light are longer. The cold has lost some of its bite on the soft days, although the bite returns on the cold days. The first soft warmth of the sun, when the sun is out, is just perceptible on the south wall of the Taig Tughade, where a small spot of warmth in the early afternoon will, in another 2 weeks, begin to thaw the small bit of ice in the small pool at the foot of the wall. The hens, who have not been laying through the deep midwinter, have begun, in the last few days, to lay a few small eggs again, scratching about in the small straw-littered byre yard with a new soft interest in life. And the sheep, out on the rough grazing of the moor at the back of the croft, are beginning to look heavy. The man of the croft has walked out to the fold this morning to check on them. He has come out of the byre, around the corner of the house, past the lazy beds, past the small stack of peats that is still substantial after the careful winter use, past the small stack of hay that is now perhaps half of what it was in November, but is still enough to see the cows through to the spring grass, and out along the small path that runs from the back of the croft up onto the lower edge of the moor. He is wearing his heavy dark working jacket against the cold, and his cap pulled low, and his stout leather boots, which have held well through the winter since he mended them in January, the small patch of new leather still firm at the back of the heel. His hands are deep in his pockets. His breath is rising in slow white clouds in the cold morning air. The ewes of the small flock, perhaps 30 of them, are spread out in their slow, patient way across the lower moor. They are heavy with lamb. The lambing on this croft, as on most Lewis crofts, begins in early March, and the ewes are now in the last 6 or 8 weeks before they begin to drop. Their flanks are wide. Their wool is thick. They move slowly through the soft heather, their heads down, taking up the small bits of dry grass and the small bits of soft moss that they can find on the winter moor. The ram, off to one side, is standing apart, looking at the man as he comes. The man walks slowly through the small flock. He does not hurry. He stops at one ewe, lays his hand on her back, feels the heavy, slow shift of the lamb inside her. He nods slowly. He moves to the next. The ewes know him. He has walked among them every week of their lives. They lift their heads as he passes, look at him with their calm, patient eyes, and go back to the grazing. It is hard, in early February on a Lewis croft, to know exactly when each ewe will lamb. The man's eye is the only guide. He looks at the swing of her belly. He looks at her udder. He looks at how she moves. He has, by long experience, a slow, patient sense of which ewe is closest. He thinks this morning that one of the older ewes, a black-faced cross who has lambed for him every spring for 6 years, is perhaps 3 weeks from her time. He decides he will bring her in to the byre at the end of the next week, ahead of the others, to keep her quiet and safe in the warm, dim straw for her last week of carrying. The other ewes can stay on the moor for a little longer. The weather, on the long-term feel of it, is not going to be hard. The bodach, the old grandfather, who knows the weather of these moors as well as he knows the lines of his own hand, has said that the rest of February will be mild, with a few cold nights but no real storm. The man has learned, over the years, to trust the bodach's weather sense. He will leave the ewes on the moor for another 2 weeks, and then begin, slowly, to bring them in. He turns now and walks slowly back down the path toward the croft. The sun, low in the southeast, is just up above the long, flat shoulder of the moor behind him. The light is the soft, pale gold of a Hebridean early February morning, weak but clear. The sea, off to the west below the township, is silver in the morning light, with the long, slow swell catching the sun in soft flashes. He passes the small lochen at the back of the croft. The lochen is still, in the soft, cold air, its small, dark surface unbroken. A single greylag goose, paddling slowly across the far side, lifts her head and looks at him as he passes. He looks at her. He walks on. He comes back to the croft. The daughter-in-law is at the front door, with the small son beside her, the two of them shaking out the small mats that have been on the kitchen floor through the long winter. The soft, small puffs of dust and ash and dried straw rising into the cold, clear morning air and being carried off on the soft southwest wind. The small daughter is on the step, with a small wooden bowl in her hand, scattering a few grains of barley for the few hens that are scratching about in the yard. The man stops at the door. He looks at his wife. He says in the soft, quiet Gaelic of the morning that the ewes are well, that the older black face is close, that he will bring her in at the end of next week. The daughter-in-law nods slowly. She knows what this means. The lambing is coming. The byre will need to be made ready. The small lambing pen at the back will need to be built up. The work of the new year is beginning to lift, in its slow, patient way, out of the long quiet of the inside year. The Gaelic is in the kitchen at her loom. She has woven through January perhaps a third of the cloth that she set out to weave this winter. The new tweed is growing on the loom, soft and grey-brown and warm, with a small thin band of the rust-red dye running through it that the Gaelic has added for the small daughter's new winter skirt next year. The Gaelic is sitting at the loom in her low wooden stool, the slow, steady rhythm of the heddles and the shuttle and the beater going on, hour after hour, through the soft, pale light of the February day. She will weave on through this month and into the next, and finish the cloth before the lambing properly begins. The bodach is in his chair by the fire, with his small clay pipe in his hand, looking into the soft red glow of the peat. He has, on this quiet February morning, fallen into a slow, patient half-sleep, the way that very old men fall into a slow, patient half-sleep by a peat fire in the soft light of the late winter morning. His head is bowed a little. His pipe is in his hand. His breathing is slow and even. The small dog, on the rug by his feet, is asleep. The man of the croft comes in. He hangs his jacket on the wooden peg by the door. He sits down at the kitchen table. The daughter-in-law brings him a small wooden bowl of porridge, made with the new milk that the cow has begun to give again now that her own time is coming close, and sweetened with a small dab of honey from the small jar that the family has kept since the small harvest of the township beehives last autumn. He eats slowly. The light through the small kitchen window is the soft pale gold of the February morning. The peat fire is glowing soft on the hearth. The small click of the loom is going on slowly in the background. The slow breath of the bodach is going on slowly by the fire. The new year is coming slowly in its long, patient way out of the long dark of the winter. In another 3 weeks, the older ewe will be in the byre. In another 5 weeks, she will lamb. In another 6 weeks, the first lazy beds will be turned with the castrome. In another 8 weeks, the cattle will be moved up to the shalings. In another 10 weeks, the corncrake will be calling again on the moor. And the whole long, slow Hebridean year on this small croft on the western side of the Isle of Lewis will be beginning again in its long, patient way, as it has begun every year for many generations, and as it will begin for these people and for their children for many years more. Stay with them in the warm, dim kitchen, with the soft, pale February light coming through the small window and the slow click of the loom and the slow breath of the bodach, by the fire and the man of the croft, eating his slow, patient porridge at the table. The dark is loosening, the light is coming back. The lambs are not yet here, but they are coming. The year is ready to begin again. Let your breath go long. There is nowhere else to be. We have come to the end of our year on the small croft on the western side of the Isle of Lewis in the year 1900. 12 months, one for each chapter, from the first lambs of March in the dim warmth of the byre, through the spring sowing, the moving of the cattle to the shalings, the long midsummer light of June, the slow patient work of the peat in July, the hay in August, the harvest in September, the herring boats sailing out in October, the cattle coming home in November, the long winter visiting and the wren song of December, the slow indoor crafts, and the bard's recitation in January, and the first soft loosening of the dark in February as the new year prepares to begin again. If you are still listening, you are very welcome to begin again at the start and walk the year over once more. The croft is still there. The Gaelic is still at her wheel. The cows are still in the byre. The slow Atlantic is still making its long breath on the white shell shore. But if your eyes are heavy, let them stay heavy. Let your breath stay long. Let the soft peat smoke and the slow Gaelic of the kitchen carry you the rest of the way. There is nothing left to do tonight. Sleep well, and we will walk somewhere else in Scotland soon on another quiet night.